Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. Compression is one of the most popular processes we have in mixing and music production, and because it's so powerful and offers so many different parameters, there are a multitude of ways by which we can use it in our mixes. In this video, I want to discuss serial versus parallel versus sidechain compression, three of the more advanced techniques that we have with compression, and show you how and why we may want to use those in our mixes. I write about all of this and more in my ebook, Mixing with Compression. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below if you'd like to check that out. But I really want to show you these three different methods of using compression in our mixes in this video. Some more advanced use cases, if you will. And so let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro, and you see I have the Pro C2 from FabFilter here. Before we get started, I just want to go over the basics of compression. So we can think about compression as a dynamics processor. It is a dynamics processor, and it helps to reduce or compress the dynamic range of a signal. And it does so by setting a set threshold, a set level, and then effectively turning down any output when the input signal goes above that threshold. And so, for example, I have this particular compressor on the snare top of this mix. I have the threshold set at negative 25.33 dBFS. And so any input signal that goes above this threshold at negative 25 will trigger the compressor to act upon the output and actually turn it down. If I go over to the ratio right here, we have a ratio of 4:1. And so for every 4 dB that goes above this negative 25.33 dB threshold, the compressor will only output a single dB above the 25.33 dB threshold. And so if we think about mixing as a balancing game, which is the primary goal of mixing to achieve a great balance, compression can be thought of as a sort of automatic balance control, which keeps signals from being too loud, keeps the peaks of signals from being too loud in the mix. So if I was to play back the snare and just solo it, we see a little bit of gain reduction happening right here on these peaks. So as the input surpasses this set threshold, we can see this dotted line on the horizontal plane. Whenever the snare hits, there's a little bit of gain reduction that happens. If I turn up the ratio, we will get more. And if I turn down the threshold, we will definitely get more gain reduction or compression. So that is the basics of compression. Then we also have the attack and release times right here. The attack time basically tells the compressor how fast to react to the signal coming in, and the release time tells the compressor how slow to disengage once that signal drops down below the threshold once again. There's a whole lot more to know about compression, and I do have a video going into all of the details on the different parameters we have available to us in compressors. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. But that's basically how compressors work, and with that knowledge, we can move ahead and talk about serial, parallel, and sidechain compression. So if you are familiar with electronics, this will make a bit more sense to you when we talk about series versus parallel compression. Analog audio signals are essentially alternating current, and so it makes sense to discuss them and the routing with the same terminology we use in electronics. And so serial compression in the most basic sense is having an audio signal run through a compressor. So it's inputted into one compressor, outputted from that compressor into another compressor, and so on and so forth. And each compressor in this chain acts in series, and so they are one after another. This can be done on a single insert. For example, if I wanted to add in just the stock compressor from Logic, I could duplicate this on a single channel, and therefore I would have 4 compressors in series right here. But it also applies in the general routing of the mix. So if we go back to this snare top, for example, and then turn on the processing that I actually had in the mix, we have a little bit of compression happening here with the SSL E-channel strip. We have a little bit of compression happening here with the CLA76 FET compressor. Although these aren't compressors, we do have a little bit of compression happening with the decapitator, with the Saturn II, which are both distortion/saturation plugins. And then after that, we have this track being outputted to bus 1. And if we go to bus 1 over here, we have our drum subgroup, the input being bus 1, where there's more compression going on. And so this signal over here that originated in the snare top channel is being passed through all of the compressors in this insert chain. Then it's being outputted to the drum subgroup, which is also being compressed. And then this drum subgroup is being sent to the stereo out. And if we scroll over to the stereo out right here, we have some mix bus compression happening with the same SSL comp right here. And so with serial compression, we can get multiple compressors acting on a single signal. And if there's any general sound characteristics or character of those compressors, we can combine them together, so to speak, on the same signal. So sometimes compressors can be used to add a lot of gain reduction. Sometimes they are used more so for their character and their inherent sound. And so we can combine both of those things when we set up our compressors in serial on a certain track, whether that is all on the inserts of the track itself or throughout the entire signal path of that track as it goes from the original channel to the mix bus. Another big benefit of utilizing serial compression is that each of the compressors in line don't have to work as hard to compress the signal, and therefore we can get less artifacts, less pumping, and less distortion from the compressor, and in turn apply more natural sounding gain reduction and then more makeup gain to bring the signal up to the same perceived loudness. Again, without the pumping that often comes from trying to get one compressor to do all of the work. And so to demonstrate this, let's go to the drum subgroup as an example. I'm going to turn off this bus compression and this Saturn II. So we are just dealing with a clean drum subgroup right here. Again, this is bus 1, so I'm sending all of my drums right here, the kicks, snares, hi-hats, 2 toms, overhead, and room. And what I'll do is add the stock Logic compressor right here in stereo. Let's turn off auto gain and let's give it a ratio of 4:1, let's say. And let's aim to apply about 8 dB of gain reduction here, just for the sake of demonstration. I wouldn't actually do this in a mix, but I just want to make things obvious for you here to help explain how much more gentle serial compression can be versus trying to get one compressor to do everything. So we're gonna stick everything on Platinum Digital right here and have a listen. And now what I'm going to do is duplicate these compressors over here. And so that 10 dB of gain reduction, I'm going to attempt to get that same amount of compression using 3 compressors. And so I'm going to want about 3 and a bit dB of compression on each of these compressors. I hope you're following what I'm saying here. So the first compressor right here, I'll actually exit out of that one and I'm going to turn up the threshold. I'm going to keep everything else the same here. A little over 3. Let's open up the next one. And the third. And so each of these compressors are now giving me about 3 and a bit dB, so we can add them up to get to that 10. And the first compressor that I have here is also giving 10. So let's have a listen right here to how natural this sounds. Now I'll A-B to the first compressor. So you hear with the 3 compressors here, we are compressing more of the signal. The cymbals are being brought up. You can hear that the cymbals are compressed versus this compressor right here. When it's acting, it's slamming down on the kick drum and then it's pumping back up for the rest of it. And so I know that this is a rather extreme example. I want to really make things obvious here. I wouldn't do either of these on the drum bus. But you can hear the differences in pumping when I'm trying to do all of that gain reduction with a single compressor. And then you hear, although it is crushed because we are applying 10 dB of gain reduction with these 3 compressors, it does sound more uniform on the entirety of the drum kit rather than just pumping against that kick drum. And so once again, sounds a little bit more natural, a little bit less pumping. And then also if we have a look here with this compressor, when we're getting to that negative 10 dB of gain reduction, we're not actually coming all the way back up to 0. And so we're actually getting more compression out of these. If we have a quick listen here, you see that it's hovering somewhere around -5. Between the kick drum hits in some instances, and so we aren't actually getting that full 10 dB of gain reduction there, which would require this needle to come all the way back to 0, if that makes sense. Whereas if we have a look at the other 3 compressors right here, these are actually coming back to 0, and so we're actually getting more compression while also making it sound more natural. always coming back to 0 on each of these. So it sounds more natural and we're getting more gain reduction. And one other test I want to have a look at is actually looking at the peak level of the drum subgroup. So with this compressor, negative 2.4. Let's loop that section and now have a listen to these three right here. So we have about 2 dB of extra headroom that we can utilize using 3 compressors in serial to get the same amount of gain reduction versus having to rely on one single compressor right here. And so again, this is a rather extreme example, but if we extrapolate that into the rest of the mix, we can see how serial compression can be used to give more natural results and actually more compression without it sounding like there's more compression due to the distortion and the artifacts and the pumping that is often involved with hitting one compressor too hard in the mix. So again, to reiterate, serial compression, as the name would suggest, is running one signal through multiple compressors in series. That can be on a single track, and it can also be throughout the entire routing of the mix. Moving on, we have parallel compression, which is a form of upward compression. So in the beginning of this video, when I was discussing compressors, I was discussing downward compression, where we'll have a compressor acting upon the peaks of an audio signal and acting to turn those peaks down in order to reduce the dynamic range. Upward compression is sort of the opposite, where we're actually turning up the lowest levels and not necessarily paying that much attention to the peaks, again, in an effort to compress the dynamic range. And so we can do this with parallel compression. And if you are familiar with the terms in electronics, we have series, which is running one device after another, and then we have parallel, which is running them simultaneously. In the audio world, we have our dry signals, and then we have our wet signals. The dry signal will be an uncompressed version of the signal, and then we will run a parallel version of that and compress the parallel version, and then mix them together in parallel, hence the name parallel compression. And so if we stick to the drums right here, I have all of these drums, the kicks, snares, hi-hats, toms, overheads, and rooms, and I will solo all of these. You see that they are all being routed to bus 1, which again is the drum subgroup. Then I have most of these being routed to bus 11. So you see here I have the kicks, the snares, no hi-hat, the 2 toms, no overheads, and then a bit of the room. So the shells and the room are all being routed to bus 11. Then if I scroll over here, we have bus 11 coming in on the drum parallel compression group. And then I have this SSL comp, the G master bus compressor from Waves. I have a little bit of saturation going on, which also applies additional compression, but I can turn this off for the sake of demonstration. And then I have an EQ, which actually isn't doing anything. And so in this case, I have the dry signals over here, the actual drums. And you can notice here that there is a bit of compression on the individual channels here. So this is parallel and series compression in a way, because some of these tracks are being compressed here, and then they're also being compressed on the parallel channel bus. But for the sake of not adding to the confusion, let's assume that none of these tracks right here are being compressed at all. They are all dry, uncompressed signals, and they are having their outputs routed to bus 1, which is the dry signal, and then they are also being sent to bus 11, which is the parallel signal. And then we go to the drum group right here. The output of the drum group is the stereo output, as is the case with the drum parallel compression right here. So that is the point at which they are being mixed back together. By sending the signal to the drum parallel compression bus and then compressing this, we are applying downward compression to the parallel channel. So we're bringing down the peak level. And then when we mix it back with the dry signals, we are giving less peak level to the mix versus the lower and average level signals that aren't being compressed in the parallel compression bus. And so in that way, we are effectively getting upward compression, where we're adding more to the average below the threshold values, and we are adding less to the above threshold values. And so to make this more obvious, I'm going to turn the attack way down, make the attack super fast on the solid state logic compressor right here. I'll turn off analog as well. And we are going to see that I'm really slamming the compressor on the drum parallel bus. So every time there's a peak, I'm getting a lot of gain reduction right there. And then between the peaks, this needle is coming back almost to 0. And so I hope that you understand that when these two are mixed together, the peak levels coming out of this channel are going to be greatly reduced. And then again, the average or the lower signal levels are going to be almost to where they were at naturally. And so we're getting that upward style compression. And this can help to fatten things out, make them sound larger and bigger within the mix. And I really like parallel compression on drums for this reason. So let's have a listen back here, and I'm just going to adjust the level of the parallel compressor output. little bit. So we're still getting a lot of compression right here. You can really hear it in the drum rooms there. Pay special attention to the drum rooms which are being sent here. The drum rooms really help with the overall ambience and the space of the drums and give us a sense of that drum room. And when I'm really pushing the parallel compression, the rooms are relatively low, and so those are being brought up with the upward compression. And then the kick and snare and other close mic'd instruments are just being thickened up a little bit. And I'll also mute the snare plate just to make it a bit more obvious here. You hear that lower level stuff being brought up in the mix, and you hear the close mics being fattened up a little bit. And typically my drum compression effects returns aren't mixed that loud, but they are just a way to help thicken up the drums and give them a little bit more character in the mix. Now, parallel compression is common on drums and drum subgroups. We can also utilize it on vocals. We can utilize it on other instruments as well. Again, just to help thicken them up and apply some of that upward compression to reduce the dynamic range without overly affecting the peaks of the dry signal. So for example, if I was to go over here to the keys and turn off these compressors, and then send this to another bus right here. Let's go key PC, and I'll actually create a track so that it's right next to the keys over here. Solo this, and then apply some compression, and then play some keys through it. Helps to thicken out the sound a little bit here. Of course, we are not perfectly level matched. It's pretty much impossible to A/B this effectively. So at the risk of reducing some of the transients, particularly of instruments that don't necessarily have strong transients, we can get a nice thickening of the sound, which really works well on vocals. We can actually have a listen to it on vocals. I believe I'm doing a little bit of parallel compression on the vocals here. Let's go to the chorus. We can actually send to a parallel compressor. Let's send it to the same keys one that we just set up. Now we can have a listen. And so I'll bring this down and then bring it up in the mix.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground? Surrounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make when you're lying inside of me. Feels so right, why can't you see me?
And with parallel compression or upward compression, we can bring up a little bit more of the nuances in a vocal, of which there are many. The vocal is perhaps the most expressive instrument we have. And so utilizing parallel compression or upward compression is a great way to bring up some of that nuance that may be buried under the mix otherwise. So that is parallel compression in a nutshell. And before we move on to sidechain compression, I want to briefly mention a great plugin. It's a free one from Extra Records. If you do happen to use Ableton Live, you have this inside your DAW already. But for those of us who don't use Ableton Live, this is a great free plugin. It is a multi-band compressor that offers both downward and upward compression. And if I was to show you what the E piano sounds like without it, and then with, you can hear a lot of that transient information come out. And even when I let go of a key, you can hear a lot of that nuance. Versus having this off, a lot of that gets lost. And so that is a lot of upward compression being applied to this piano. Obviously, it's very extreme in this case. And then there's also a lot of downward compression being applied to really crush the dynamics here. Also, before we move on, this is a multi-band compressor, which means that we have bands split up into the lows, the mids, and the highs. And each of these bands, in this case, effectively has its own compressor applying downward and upward compression. So if we just pick up a regular multi-band compressor, for example, the stock one, the multipressor from Logic, you can see that we have 4 bands, each with its own compressor controls right here that act independently of one another. We have independent control over the threshold, over the makeup gain, over the ratio, the peak RMS values, the attack, the release, and even some expansion in this case. So in addition to what I'm teaching you here with serial, parallel, and sidechain compression, we also have multiband compression, which can be used in place of full band compressors with each of these techniques if we want it. Now with that, let's move on to sidechain compression, which is one of my favorite techniques in music production and mixing. And so if we go back to the Pro C2, which has, again, a nice visual interface, we can revisit how a compressor actually works. And so what I was saying earlier about the input signal having to surpass a set threshold before the compressor acts, I say that because it's typically the input signal that is utilized as the sidechain signal. And what a sidechain signal is the signal that actually triggers the compressor on and off. So most generally, we will have an input signal go into a compressor, and then that signal will be sent to the gain reduction circuit, and it will also be sent to a sidechain circuit, which will act upon the gain reduction circuit. This can happen before the gain reduction circuit itself in feed-forward designs, or after the gain reduction circuit itself in feedback designs. The main point here is that the sidechain signal is actually what triggers the compressor and causes it to apply gain reduction to the program signal. And while it is typically the input signal that is used as the sidechain, it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so the technique of sidechain compression is actually when we take an external signal and use that as the sidechain signal instead of the input signal. So, for example, we can take this snare top, which is nice and transient, and we can use that to trigger the compression on the bass, for example. So if I drag this Pro C2 over here to the bass, let's actually make this a bit smaller here, free up some real estate. I'll put this in the corner. We can solo the snare top and then the bass right here so that we can really focus on them. And so now that this Pro C2 is acting upon the bass, I can go up to this sidechain signal right here, choose audio, snare top, which is right here, audio 6. And now whenever the snare top surpasses this set threshold, the compressor will apply gain reduction to the bass guitar. So let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Before we get started, I actually have to go down here to sidechain and choose external. So you see, whenever the snare hits, it's applying that gain reduction. And so this is a great way to help with frequency masking of instruments. For example, I actually have this set up in this mix. I found that the horns and the vocals often competed with each other. And so on the horn bus right here, I have just the stock compressor from Logic, and the sidechain right here, audio 18, is the lead vocal. So whenever the lead vocal is present, this compressor is going to automatically reduce the output level of the entire horn bus. So all of the horns being sent to this bus are going to be turned down whenever the vocal is present. We can actually have a look to what is happening in the chorus when both instruments, the lead vocal and the horns, are being played at the same time.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground?
So you saw there that between the vocal takes, the gain reduction went back to 0 because, again, the vocal is what is controlling the gain reduction of this compressor, which is acting upon the horn bus. So that is perhaps the primary reason to utilize sidechain compression, but we can also use it to add a little bit more rhythm to our instruments within the mix. For example, if we go back to this bass over here and we have the snares acting upon it, we can get a little bit of rhythm out of this bass.
Why do you take
Or if I was to take this and put it on the hi-hats, can help to add a little bit more rhythm here. Without any. Still a nice groove. You can just add a little bit more rhythm here, which is another great use of sidechain compression, especially when you're not using real drums and you have a relatively same-ish sampling going on. For example, if you're sampling a hi-hat and you don't have a whole lot of variation in those samples, maybe you're not using velocity right in the MIDI, or you're literally just copying and pasting a sample within the mix, you can actually go in and apply some sidechain compression against other rhythmic elements to add some more movement to those hi-hats. And then finally, we have the classic EDM pumping. So for example, we can even set up a situation where we have ghost sidechaining, as I like to call it. For example, I can go take a snare sample right here, cut this, copy it, create a new track, for example, audio, and I will call this ghost sidechain. And then I can even go to the output, apply no output, unsolo everything, go in here and paste this information here. Trying to do this quickly. Let's just do 4 bars of this. This is not being outputted because there's no output right here. So we can't actually hear it going to the mix bus and being outputted from Logic. However, what we can do is come in here and set up another compressor. I'll just use the stock one for this purpose. Sidechain, we can set that to the ghost sidechain, which will be all the way at the bottom right here. Now, if I was to play this back, we can see that even though this is not being sent to the mix bus, it will be triggering this compressor right here. Now, if I was to play some keys, we can get that classic pumping effect here. And I can make that even faster if I'd like, or do whatever rhythm I would want with a ghost sidechain. Then if I wanted a deeper pumping, you notice here that it is no longer actually getting back to 0 before the next hit happens. I can bring down this and then actually go through and duplicate this compressor so that we have it acting in series. And again, when we are processing in series, we can get a bit more gain reduction by making each compressor work a little bit less hard. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like now. So we're getting a lot of gain reduction, and between each hit, this needle is actually able to get back to 0. Additionally, we can also opt to use sidechain compression on our parallel buses if we wanted. So that's what this might sound like. Just a little bit more movement there. Again, I'm applying sidechain compression on the parallel compression bus. And so we can mix and match these different processes and different compression strategies in our mixes to get whatever results we want out of our compressors. So that's what I've got for you here inside Logic Pro today. All right, I hope you can see the power and utility of utilizing serial, parallel, and sidechain compression in your mixes and music production. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. You can click on that, sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send it to you right away. It goes through my entire framework for mixing from start to finish, helping you to make the right decisions at the right times to improve your mixes. So once again, that is the first link in the description box down below. And if you'd like to hang out with me more here on YouTube, I do have another few videos in the top left and right corner worth checking out. I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you are interested in subscribing to the Mighty Microphone YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.